vamos avanzando de manera exitosa en este evento. En especial celebramos y agradecemos la honrosa presencia del embajador de Jamaica, de ese importante corazón de nuestro Caribe, quien además de su importante trayectoria profesional y diplomática, recién nuestro presidente del Consejo Permanente de la organización, y quien además pues tiene una trayectoria académica sobresaliente, especialmente importante en el mundo del derecho, la jurisprudencia, de las relaciones internacionales en casas del pensamiento tan ilustres como pues, Oxford y Cambridge. Adelante, embajador, y mil gracias de nuevo.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gonzalez, for that kind introduction. Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I know the hour is a bit late. You may be a little sleepy, so I will try my best not to put you any further in that direction. It's my pleasure to be here and to speak about refugee issues in the Caribbean, a government perspective. First, I should tell you what I propose to cover very briefly. First of all, the importance of the Caribbean perspective on refugee matters. Why am I here, in effect? Secondly, I would like to talk a bit about the refugee policy of Jamaica and to look at it as a model that may or may not be acceptable to other Caribbean countries. I would like to suggest some of the factors that help to determine the Jamaica's refugee policy. Then thirdly, I would like to look at the refugee policy in practice. What are some of the issues that are provided for and what are some of the challenges? And then finally, in closing, I had indicated to myself that I would talk about 3 issues not expressly addressed in the refugee policy, but having come perhaps an hour ago and heard questions coming from the floor, I have now increased it to 5 issues not addressed in the refugee policy. And I would also like to say, having regard to the questions asked, I'm not in a position to answer any questions about the website of the Jamaica mission to the OAS. The importance of inserting a Caribbean perspective here today. First of all, the Caribbean countries are, without fail, part of the inter-American system. And the Caribbean countries have issues relating to refugee matters, and the Caribbean countries can learn from Latin American countries in relation to refugee matters. So I envisage a two-way street in the learning process in respect of refugee matters. Hence, it's important that we are here. Secondly, Caribbean countries make a good faith effort to meet international human rights standards. And I believe these good faith efforts should be publicized. If you talk about refugee matters within the inter-American system and you don't publicize what the Caribbean countries are doing, it creates the impression that the Caribbean countries are doing little or nothing in this regard. And having regard to the Refugees Convention and the protocol, there are 9 Caribbean states parties. I see some representatives here. Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Dominica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago. So first point I want to indicate is that Caribbean countries are very supportive of the international legal regime concerning refugee protection. The third general observation as to why it's important for Caribbean views to be heard is that Caribbean countries regard ourselves as firmly within the mainstream of human rights matters. But very often when we are mentioned, it's in the context of criticisms. So that I am sure you would have heard before today about our challenges with LGBT, and you would have heard before today about our challenges with the death penalty. But that is only a part of the picture. What I would like to submit is that Caribbean countries are, in large part, countries that respect human rights norms, and so we need to publicize the extent to which we do so. Lastly, by way of preliminary comment, I should remark that there are, of course, differences among the Caribbean countries on refugee matters, but there will be similarities, especially as to the challenges we face and the general context of refugee flows. So that's the broad background. Now, Jamaica's refugee policy. The Jamaican cabinet approved a formal policy position on refugees in 2009. This policy sets out procedures for the management of refugee status determination and reiterates the rights that are available to refugees. Thus, the policy deals with the important question, who is a refugee? That's the first thing the policy seeks to deal with. Then it indicates the governmental arrangements for refugee applications. And thirdly, it considers the rights and duties of refugees. I do not propose to go through these rules in the policy in any detail, but I would like to consider some of the issues that have informed the policy and some of the approaches taken within the policy. So, factors influencing the refugee policy of Jamaica. 1. Refugee law, or international refugee law. Jamaica became a party to the Refugees Convention on July the 30th, 1964, and to the protocol on October the 30th, 1980. So in a sense, the refugee policy of Jamaica is an attempt to give administrative structure to Jamaica's international commitments. This is reflected in the policy. The first sentence of the policy indicates that it's seeking to reflect international commitments. First sentence, quote, "The government is committed to ensuring that Jamaica adheres to its obligations under the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees, and that those who are fleeing persecution are given the protection they need." So right up front, what has influenced the Jamaican policy? The law. Later on in the document, there are repeated statements that the objective of refugee policy is to ensure that Jamaica meets its obligations under the Convention and Protocol. In further affirmation of the importance attached to refugee law and policy, the policy relies expressly on the Convention and relies expressly on Article 1A2 on the determination of refugee status, on Article 1F on the exclusion of refugee status, on Article 1C on the cessation of refugee status, and on Articles 35 and 36 on reporting obligations. So they go through the convention and they have taken out some of the more important rules and they have said, these are the things we believe. Now, the cynic might say that the policy protests too much because it keeps saying we are applying the law. But this would be an unfair comment. The fair point is that the persons responsible for drafting the policy were careful to acknowledge the central role of the Convention and Protocol in refugee determination processes. They were also mindful that express links to the Convention and Protocol would allow officials implementing the policy to have ready regard to relevant international jurisprudence on refugee issues. So if you use a term in the refugee policy, that's a term in the convention, and that term is interpreted by the Inter-American Court or by other refugee determining agencies, then you have jurisprudence that will help you in guiding, in deciding who is a refugee and so forth. So the first point is the law is important. Secondly, in the factors influencing Jamaica's refugee policy, Second point is the issue of scale, size. The cynic may ask, but if Jamaica ratified the protocol in 1980, why did it take 29 years for the policy to be put in place? If I were not acting as ambassador, I would give some cynical answers myself. But I am acting as ambassador, so I should say, it may be that a part of the answer to this question turns on the challenges faced by a relatively small governmental bureaucracy in preparing legislative and quasi-legislative rules. So we are small, we don't have a lot of resources, it takes a long time to pass legislation and to formulate policy positions. But in addition, the delay may be attributed to perceptions of the scale of refugee issues in Jamaica and the episodic character of these issues. What do I mean by that? Episodic is a nice word. Statistics for the period from 2002 to 2012 reveal the following. In 2002, 4 persons applied for refugee status in Jamaica. All 4 received refugee status. All 4 were from Haiti. In 2003, 6 people applied for refugee status in Jamaica. All 6 received refugee status. 2 were from Haiti, 3 from Burma, or maybe it was Myanmar then, or maybe it was Burma, I'm not sure, and 1 was from Rwanda. That's 2003. In 2004, and this is what I mean by episodic, 569 Haitians applied. 19 were granted refugee status, and 550 were returned to Haiti. So you move from 4 to 6 to 569. In 2005, 403 Haitians applied. None were granted refugee status. 2 Burmese applied, and both were granted refugee status. In 2006, 1 person applied from Rwanda. In 2007, and was granted. Rwanda was granted. 1 person applied in 2007 from Uganda, was granted. 2008, none. 2009, none. Right up to 2012. In 2012, 1 person applied, a Mexican, and he or she withdrew the application before it was processed. So you have a situation in which in some years you have lots and lots of applications requiring assessment, and in other years you have very few applications or none. And so what may have happened is that people in the Jamaican bureaucracy may have said, well, if we're getting only 1 application or 2, do we really need to have a policy in place? And then you get 569, and the question is answered for you. Yes? So that the scale and episodic character helps to explain things. So the policy may not have been regarded as a pressing requirement in some years, while in others, with an upsurge in applications, the need for a policy was clear. This perspective seems to be borne out also for the period before 2002. I gave you figures from 2002. For example, in 1996, the Jamaican government announced on May 15th its decision to repatriate 57 Cuban applicants who had sought refugee status in Jamaica. This prompted a fair degree of debate in the society and highlighted the need for a structured policy framework on refugee matters. Returning to the question of scale for a moment, the UNHCR reports that as of, on its website, reports that as of January 2012, the following figures were applicable to Jamaica. The number of refugees in Jamaica in January 2012 were 20. The number of asylum seekers, 0. Returned refugees, 0. Internally displaced persons, 0. Returned internally displaced persons, 0. Stateless persons, 0. And there's a category called various persons of concern, 0. So the total population of persons of concern in Jamaica, according to the UNHCR, as of January 2012, was 20 persons. I did a little checking for some other Caribbean countries to see how many refugees were in these countries. As of 2010, the World Bank figures, as of 2010, Antigua, none. Bahamas, 28. Barbados, none. Belize, 134 refugees. Cayman Islands, 1. Dominica, 1. No, 0. The Dominican Republic, 599. Cuba, 411. Grenada, none. Guyana, 7. Haiti, none. Jamaica, 2010, 21. St. Kitts Nevis, none. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, none. St. Lucia, none. Trinidad and Tobago, 29. And just so you get a sense of scale, for the United Kingdom, 238,150. And for the United States, 264,574. So that when people are talking about the scale, you see that this is technically, well, this is not a major political question in terms of people coming in. But at different times, it becomes a significant political question, and when there's an upsurge, and then it goes back down. But that helps, I think, to explain why there is no regional treaty on refugee protection in the Caribbean. A third factor that has influenced Jamaican refugee policy concerns geography and geopolitics. Geography. Jamaica, if you imagine the map, Jamaica is located between Cuba, 90 miles away, and Haiti, 100 miles away. In the Caribbean, it is a political fact that the countries that generate the most asylum seekers are Cuba and Haiti, for various reasons, but that's the political fact. So Jamaica is the closest country. In the case of Haiti, Dominican Republic is the closest country. But for Jamaica, the two closest countries in the Caribbean are the two that generate the most asylum seekers. One country 90 miles away, the other country 100 miles away. Now, you know the realities. Most of the asylum seekers, and I think it relates to a question that was posed in part earlier on, most of the asylum seekers from Haiti and Cuba have tended not to want to sail to Jamaica. They have tended to want to sail north to Florida. And they usually end up in Jamaica because they have compass challenges and challenges of that nature. So they end up in Jamaica and they say, we are seeking asylum, we are refugees, we have problems at home. And at that stage, Jamaica then has to embark upon the refugee determination process. So geography is one factor. The UNHCR on its now famous website says that the vast majority of persons from Cuba and Haiti are, quote, striving to reach North America and the USA more than any other country. Another factor, this is geopolitical now, relates to Cuba and the USA. Because there was a time in the 1980s and up to the early 1990s when the United States said anybody who has left Cuba and comes to the United States is entitled to refugee status automatically. So this could have encouraged a flow of persons. And then you know about the Mariel boat lift, yes, where the Cuban government said, all right, since you are saying that all of the people who live here are refugees, because you want to suggest that we are such a bad regime, here, take some. Take some of the people that you want. And so they had the Mariel boat lift. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. changed its policy on this so that there has been a bit of a reduction in the number of Cubans ending up in Jamaica en route to the United States, or hopefully en route to the United States, in their views. Another geopolitical factor, or primarily political, concerns the unsettled nature of Haitian politics just after the first ouster of President Aristide. Jamaica saw a significant upsurge at that time in persons seeking refugee status. And many of these people came to Jamaica and said, La Vala, we are from Aristide's party, we are from the flood, and we are now being discriminated against by the military regime and so on. So that explains part of the upsurge and why Jamaica is in the midst of things. As a matter of fact, at about that time, what Jamaica did, because there are so many people who are leaving Haiti trying to get to North America, the USA was trying to intervene, to intercept on the way, and the USA said, look, many of these boats are not going to make it to the USA anyway, so we're saving lives. And the USA and Haiti entered into an arrangement under which the USA would intercept these vessels and take them to Jamaica, the port of Kingston. And the USA put a ship, the Comfort, in Kingston Harbor and processed refugee applications. Some were returned to Haiti, some were then sent to the United States. So that the situation in Haiti has generated these issues for us. Now, another factor that has entered the debate on the policy arising from geopolitics is if you're having people from Haiti and from Cuba, and in Jamaica you have a very watchful community in terms of racial matters. Jamaicans are very, very watchful about discrimination on grounds of race. So, if you have a black Haitian who comes to Jamaica and says, I am a refugee, and he's sent back home, and then you have a white Cuban who comes to Jamaica and says, I am a refugee, and he is kept, there will be sensitivities in Jamaica. And vice versa. But it's primarily sensitivities in the suggestion is sometimes you are discriminating against Haitians and you are discriminating in favor of Cubans. That is part of the debate. One of the things that the policy seeks to stress is that in determining who is a refugee, race does not matter from the Jamaican standpoint. What matters is Article 1A2, which says you must have a well-founded fear of persecution on the stated grounds. Another factor, geopolitical, that we have to bear in mind in looking at the refugee policy is that Jamaica has traditionally had good relations with the United States, Haiti, and Cuba. So we haven't taken the position that the enemy of your enemy is my enemy. Rather, we have sought our own friends independently. So that you get Cubans coming to Jamaica and applying for refugee status. The political thought might be, but this might embarrass the Cuban regime. Or you get people coming from Haiti, this might embarrass the Haitian regime. And if we're not embarrassing one or the other, we might be embarrassing the US in the position we take. But that hasn't been a factor either. We just look at Article 1A2. Next factor, the question of resources. And I think although the refugee policy does not state this outright, this is a factor that has influenced and continues to influence Jamaican refugee policy. What do I mean? Well, first of all, there's a possibility that if you accept some people from Cuba or some people from Haiti, you will open the gate to a significant number of applications. Because if you are going to accept that the Cuban before you has left Cuba because of fear of persecution, it's possible that there will be several others who will come, similarly Haiti. And so the floodgates argument has often been put forward. Remember I referred to a 1996 episode when 57 people were sent back to Cuba? The government openly said, we fear the floodgates being opened. If we take these 57, we don't know how many others we'll have to take. And this is not just Jamaica alone in the Caribbean. In 1992 or thereabouts, or just about the time of the first Aristide ouster, and the Haitians were heading north, Congressman Rangel, who is a congressman for New York, for Harlem, wrote a letter to the CARICOM heads of government saying, I'm embarrassed, Caribbean, because you are doing nothing to help the brothers and sisters of Haiti who have this refugee crisis on their hands. They are fleeing, trying to come to America. Look how far the United States is. Why don't you open your doors for them? So wrote Congressman Rangel. At the time, the chief coordinator, or the chairman of the CARICOM Foreign Relations Committee was Dame Eugenia Charles. And Dame, in 1992, and Dame Eugenia Charles answered Rangel in a public letter and wrote in part about Dominica. We have 10% unemployment, and our unemployment is mainly among urban women and secondary school leavers. Our housing plan has always been terrible. Our drug problem is growing to our great dissatisfaction and despair. To introduce refugees into our society, refugees for whom houses would have had to be provided, and to whom some sort of stipend would have been paid, would have introduced explosive elements into our society with which we do not have the resources to cope. End of quote. So Dame Eugenia Charles is saying, if we were to take the people we want to take, it would lead to an explosive situation that we can't deal with. That was 20 odd years ago. This is still one of the central issues for refugee determination processes in the Caribbean today. On the point of limited resources, I will also note that limited resources characterize the funding of international agencies. The budget for 2012 for the Canadian Refugee body is $1,451,045, and the budget for the USA office of the regional office of the UNHCR is stated to be $20,105,657. The figure goes down for 2013 for the USA office. And that USA office is supposed to cover Puerto Rico, US Virgin Islands, all of the CARICOM states, the Dominican Republic as well. So the budget is relatively limited. I think you will agree with me. Anyway, so Caribbean countries are seriously pressured in resource terms when large number of genuine asylum seekers turn up. When genuine refugee seekers turn up, we have a problem. Now you will note that the Refugees Convention says nothing about the resource capacity of the receiving state. Refugees Convention just says if you are a refugee, the receiving state must take you. And this is part of the problem for the Caribbean. I was doing a little checking, and I found that in 1950, Sir Hurst Lauterpacht, an English judge, he was actually a Polish a man who became a refugee in England and became one of the most distinguished international lawyers in the world, an English judge on the International Court of Justice. He wrote in 1950 that it would be good to have a Refugees Convention, note 1951. It would be good to have a Refugees Convention, but this convention should require countries to receive refugees within the limits of public security and the economic capacity of the state. The Refugees Convention adopted in 1951 left out the economic capacity. It retained the public security component, but not the economic capacity component. All right. So those are the factors that have influenced Jamaica's refugee policy, scale, resources, geography, and geopolitics. But what does the policy say in practice? I've already said that it seeks to reiterate aspects of the Refugees Convention, so I won't repeat that. But it also says that it sets up institutional mechanisms to deal with refugee applications. And the main institutional mechanism is called the Eligibility Committee. So the procedure is, a person comes to Jamaica and the person says, I am a refugee. The person will first say that to an immigration officer. The immigration officer, this might be a person who comes in a boat and is met on the coastline and so on. And the immigration officer will say, oh, you think you're a refugee? Well, tell us why you think you're a refugee. Tell us the persecution you will face if you go back home. And the person will say that, and the immigration officer will fill out the form and send it to the Eligibility Committee. The Eligibility Committee may decide to interview the person or may decide not to interview the person. I would think it's highly, it's not usually the case that you will be sent back without them interviewing you. So the Eligibility Committee is set up. Now, who are the members of this Eligibility Committee? They're all senior civil servants. There are 3 persons. A senior person from the Ministry of Immigration, which is the Ministry of National Security, a senior person from the Ministry of Justice, and a senior person from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this composition tells you immigration because of security concerns, justice because you want to ensure the human rights of the persons, and foreign affairs because you have friends internationally and you want to be mindful of what you are doing in that regard. So those are the 3 persons. These 3 persons, having interviewed the refugee seeker, will make a recommendation to the permanent secretary in the ministry responsible for immigration. Now, the permanent secretary is not a political appointee. He or she is in this position even when the government changes. So that's the person the recommendation is sent to. That person can accept it and then you become a refugee. Or the permanent secretary can turn it down. Or the Eligibility Committee can say, we're not recommending this person. In either of those 2 cases, the asylum seeker has a right of appeal to a different body. So the Eligibility Committee will write, we do not think John Brown is a genuine refugee. He has established no basis for a well-founded fear of persecution on grounds of X. You get that, you can appeal. And you appeal to a body called the Refugee Review Body. And this body has a different composition. It's made up of a retired judge, a retired diplomat, and a retired permanent secretary. So the main criterion for membership of this panel is that you should have retired. And those 3 hear your appeal. I think the retirement criterion is interesting because what it is saying is you now have you owe nothing to the government of Jamaica anymore. But you have a government perspective because you were once a judge or you were once a diplomat, a government employee, or you were once a permanent secretary, a government employee. So you don't owe the government anything, but you think like government. Maybe. Okay, those 3 now review the application and make a recommendation, not to the permanent secretary, but this time to the minister responsible for immigration. And usually the minister will accept what is recommended by this body. So that's the structure. Immigration officer, eligibility committee, refugee review body, permanent secretary, minister. Right? The refugee policy also says that, well, it makes a distinction between those persons who come in with unauthorized entry, the person who comes up in a boat. Secondly, entry at a port of entry. You land at an airport and you say, I would like refugee status. You have a visa or something and you say, I would like refugee status. So you seek to change upon entry. And thirdly, you are in the country, and while you're in the country, you say, you know what, I would like to apply for refugee status. The rules that apply to each of these three categories are the same, generally speaking. But it's important to note that, well, it used to be thought in Jamaica that if you came into the country unlawfully, you would not be entitled to refugee status. So if you landed in a boat and it was abundantly clear that if you went back home, you would be killed, you would still be sent back home because it was felt unlawful entry did not generate refugee status. The policy now makes that clear, makes it clear that that is not the case. The policy, by setting out persons who come unlawfully and giving them the rights, makes it clear that it doesn't matter how you have come into the country, you are entitled to refugee status if you show that you satisfy the criteria in Article 1A2. What rights do you have if you are accepted? In Jamaica, you have the right to primary health care, primary education at the national standard level, national treatment to the refugee in terms of health and education. You may seek employment and you are entitled to a travel document. The family unit must be respected, and the family unit is regarded as spouse and children up to the age of 18. In special circumstances, children up to 23 form part of the family unit. So that is enshrined in the policy. The policy also says that you can be sent home for security reasons, and also that you can be excluded for serious non-political crimes. If you commit serious non-political crimes in Jamaica, or if you commit serious non-political crimes before you come to Jamaica, you can be excluded. This creates a bit of a lawyer's issue, I think, because let us say that I steal a boat in order to come to Jamaica as a refugee, and it's a fairly expensive boat. It's unlawful to steal in the country that I am leaving. I now get to Jamaica. I am interviewed for refugee status, and the Jamaican authorities call my home country and say, John Brown is here, and the country says, but he committed a serious crime. He stole an expensive boat. Is Jamaica then entitled to or required to send you out or keep you? That question arose indirectly in the case of the Cubans in 1996, because Cuba said they stole the boats, they are criminals. Right? But it has not been given as a reason for sending anyone home formally, but it's out there as an issue. Another point that is made in this regard in the context of Jamaica is gun running. It's sometimes said that some of the people who apply for refugee status are people who are carrying guns into Jamaica. You know, Jamaica has too many guns anyway. So once you say these are gun runners, you turn people against the people who are applying for refugee status. But that has been mentioned. All right, so that's the general framework. I'm almost done, Chairman. I promised that I would close by talking about 3 issues not expressly addressed, and it became 5 issues not expressly addressed. I will say them very quickly. 1, the policy does not expressly address what it means to have a well-founded fear of persecution on any of the grounds. Is it an objective standard where you say, yes, any reasonable person would have a well-founded fear in these circumstances? Or is it a subjective standard where you look at the person standing before you and you say, does this person have a well-founded fear in his own heart? Subjective, in the person's heart. Objective, what would a reasonable person feel in the circumstances? The policy doesn't answer that. And I don't think the UNHCR has ever given a straight, clear answer to that question. Sometimes they say it's subjective, sometimes they say it's objective. Maybe it is objectively subjective, whatever that means. So that's the first thing that's not addressed. Second thing that's not addressed is stateless persons. Notice, though, that as of right now, there are no stateless persons in Jamaica. And perhaps this helps to explain why the policy doesn't take it up. What tends to happen is that if you are a refugee in Jamaica for more than a period of about 5 years, you then become entitled to nationality status, to citizenship. Yeah? So the stateless problem is not really a problem in Jamaica. It is an issue in some other Caribbean countries, because in at least one other Caribbean country, there are rules to the effect that if you are a refugee and you have a child, that child does not become a national of the receiving state. And the child is probably not a national of the state from which you have fled, and so the child becomes stateless. That is a problem that requires attention in some of the jurisdictions. Third thing that is not addressed in the policy is, what do you do when you have refugees in your country, especially when you have a large number? Do you detain them or do you leave them in the society before you complete the processing? On some occasions, people have been detained. Some of the Haitians have been detained, but it's a loose detention in the sense that you just expected to report in the evening. So you can go and work, or you can go and have good relations with the Jamaicans, but you must report to the center when the day is done. In the case of the Cubans, they were housed by a church organization, the Franciscan Sisters of Allegheny, so that they could be located generally. But the policy doesn't say whether or not you should be detained or you should not be detained. The fourth point not addressed is the treatment within the courts. Notice that I talked about the eligibility committee and the refugee application committee, the refugee body, but nothing about the courts. There is no legislation in Jamaica that allows a refugee to say, I want my case to be heard by the Jamaican courts. This is in contrast to the United States, for instance, where once you land in America, you have the right to take your appeal right through the system up to the Supreme Court. It's a different approach. We have administrative remedies rather than a court remedy. There's an interesting question that is yet to be assessed, whether or not you can use customary international law to go to the Jamaican courts as an asylum seeker. But that's not addressed in the policy. And the last issue that is not addressed in the policy, LGBT matters. I think if the persons who formulated this policy were asked, why didn't you include LGBT matters? They would say, this policy is for people coming into Jamaica, not for people leaving Jamaica. That's the first thing they would say. The second thing they would say is, the policy does not seek to identify the different categories of persons who may claim refugee status. It just sets out what the convention says, well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds. Now, membership of a particular social group is the category that would probably capture LGBT applications. So the Jamaican authorities would say LGBT matters are implicitly dealt with here if somebody did decide to come. I don't know what the answer would be that would be given by the committee, but that's what would be said. Now, the bigger problem the bigger issue from a Jamaican point of view is the people of Jamaican nationality who are leaving. And I don't know the breakdown, maybe the breakdown is not given, but UNHCR website indicates that as of right now, there are 1,252 Jamaicans who are refugees outside of Jamaica. And there are 475 who are now applying to get refugee status. Many of these have applied to USA, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Jamaica has been subject to significant criticism in relation to its policies on LGBT matters, and this is the report on the situation of human rights in Jamaica for 2012. It came out a month ago or so, and pages 96 to about 104 deal with the issue of discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation. Within Jamaica, the matter is always being open to discussion, and there are concerns, but the fact is there is a law in Jamaica concerning homosexual activity from 1864, which says many things, from 1864. So that on one view, Jamaica needs to catch up with the rest of the world. On another view, Jamaica is a conservative country with certain religious principles which support a perspective that is against homosexual activity. That is the kind of debate that is going on. It is also going on outside of Jamaica, and external agencies are having an impact on the nature of the discussion within Jamaica. So that's what I wanted to say. The LGBT matter is not only Jamaica, it's the Commonwealth Caribbean countries are generally of the same approach with respect to these matters. So that's what I wanted to say. We continue to work with the UNHCR, and we know that according to the UNHCR, the Dominican Republic and Barbados are the only two Caribbean countries that have a framework for refugee issues. Today, I would like to assert Jamaica has one too. So the UNHCR website, I hope, will be revised to include Jamaica as well. Thank you.
Embajador, mil gracias por su erudita e importante exposición. Gracias a todos ustedes, a todos los estados, organizaciones, participantes, expositoras y expositores en este evento. Celebramos la importante concurrencia, no solamente en esta sala, sino a través de la webcast de la organización. Y la reflexión fundamental que hacemos es qué más debemos hacer, cuánto más nos queda por hacer. Es un camino largo en el cual nuestro hemisferio y nuestras Américas tienen un compromiso muy importante. Nos exhortamos todos para seguir el camino con perseverancia, con responsabilidad, tanto en el campo de la modernización de nuestros sistemas jurídicos, como en la cultura, en la conciencia de reconocer el problema y de avanzar en la conducta. Nos queda todavía en nuestras mentes la imagen de muchas personas que naufragan en búsqueda de un nuevo futuro o perseguidos por una situación, o niños y niñas al lado de campamentos en los cuales sufren la penuria, las dificultades y el dolor de la persecución. Les agradecemos de manera muy especial a todos los participantes. Son diversas las conclusiones que ustedes han de tomar en esta materia. Nuestro continente tiene una movilidad entre sus gentes permanente por distintas razones aquí expuestas. En las primeras épocas muchos de ellos llegan perseguidos por los dogmas, por las religiones, por el autoritarismo o por los sueños, por el sueño americano o por el sueño del oro o del dorado. Llegaron miles de ellos a nuestras altiplanicies, o por el éxodo del campo a la ciudad, o por la pobreza, por el terror. Los grandes desplazamientos internos que se producen en nuestros países también a veces traspasan las fronteras. En el caso nuestro, hoy lo citaba el doctor y profesor Juan Carlos Murillo. En el caso colombiano son millones de personas víctimas del desplazamiento, pero quizás el punto de partida es reconocer los problemas. Cuando abrimos las mentes a reconocer el problema y afrontarlo, cuando se abrió nuestro registro de inscripción de víctimas, hoy nos sorprendemos, más de 5.300.000 víctimas. O, como aquí se ha señalado el día de hoy, sectores de población afectadas, indígenas, incluso grupos en riesgo de extinción, como ustedes lo señalaban, grupos afrodescendientes afectados por la pobreza, pero también por el conflicto, sectores de población LGTBI, como aquí también se ha mencionado. No obstante, la reacción de todos nuestros países para abrir el sistema jurídico, para proteger, y el asilo es uno de los orgullos de nuestra América, de nuestro derecho, marca precisamente una vocación y una disposición permanente para modernizar nuestras instituciones en esta materia. Nuevos desafíos, el problema de la droga, la competencia por tierras que expulsa, pero también nuevos sueños, reformas en el mundo como la que se plantea hoy en Estados Unidos en el caso de los inmigrantes. Son motivos de esperanza, importante reflexión para reconocer los derechos fundamentales de los seres humanos, hombres, mujeres, pero en especial los más débiles, los niños, los adultos mayores, las mujeres, cabeza de familia, que son las primeras víctimas en todos estos problemas. Nosotros queremos agradecer, doctor Dante Negro, a usted y a todo su equipo, Alejandro, a todos los que han participado en la organización exitosa de este curso y de esta tarea que debemos renovar y perseverar. Y queremos igualmente, embajadores, agradecerles y destacar esa relación dinámica de nuestra América. Muchos de nuestros precursores, de nuestros libertadores, encontraron en el Caribe la fuente de inspiración libertaria. El libertador Bolívar estuvo en Haití, recordamos a Alejandro Petión, las 6.000 armas que se aportaron a los ejércitos revolucionarios para construir gobiernos de libertad, de democracia. Igualmente, desde Jamaica, el libertador Bolívar escribió una de las cartas más visionarias y más importantes del sueño de la construcción de gobiernos y de libertades. De manera que nuestra relación dinámica y nuestros sueños son comunes. Les agradecemos de manera muy, muy especial a todos los participantes, doctor Samaniego, a todos los profesores, estudiantes, funcionarios que han venido durante el curso del día, y la reflexión principal es continuar el camino, seguir adelante en esta tarea en la cual en algún momento los ciudadanos del mundo, unos solos, de un solo mundo, tendrán reconocidos fundamentalmente sus derechos. Nuestro reconocimiento muy especial de gratitud y admiración a ACNUR, a esa organización que con dedicación, con vocación de servicio, con pasión, viene trabajando incesantemente en esta tarea y cuyos pensadores profesionales hoy nos han acompañado igualmente en esta reflexión tan importante junto a todos los esfuerzos de esa otra hermana organización que es la OEA para seguir en esta tarea. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes.
Sorry, I went on. I didn't realize. Sorry. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
We appreciate the overview.
I'm trying to get you some more money, man.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it. I mean, you talk like you've been in the refugee sector for quite some time. Tell us the secrets you didn't want to reveal to everybody.
You know, the lady who was working for the UNHCR in Global, I was her colleague at the law school.
At the law school, okay.
I recruited her.
Oh, really?
So she kept me informed of certain things. But in the 1995 Cuba thing,